Welcome to the 20th anniversary of Danny Boone Regional Library's One Read program. My name is Abby Reimel, and I am your host. Tonight, we bring you How to Write True Crime, a talk by local author and attorney Morley Swingle. So now I'm going to turn it over to Morley Swingle. As you may know, he is the author of the true crime book Scoundrels to the Hoosegow, as well as several other mystery novels. Mr. Swingle is a former prosecutor and a member of the Mystery Writers of America. And I'm really excited to introduce him. Welcome, Morley.
Hi, I'm Morley Swingle, and with the one read this year being Casey Sepp's book, Furious Hours, I'm going to talk about how to write true crime, because her book is first and foremost a true crime book, but it's also a biography of Harper Lee, who wrote the classic novel To Kill a Mockingbird, and it's also a book about how to write in general. So for me, it was a fascinating book, and those of you that aren't through reading it yet, I'll try not to give too many spoilers. As far as my qualifications to talk about writing true crime, I've written one true crime book, Scoundrels to the Hoosegow. I was a prosecutor for more than 30 years, and maybe again someday. Who knows what the future will bring. Right now, I'm writing full time on a novel that's coming up. There's a biography about me on Amazon.com. It's a little old and needs to be updated, but my background is I've been a prosecutor for more than 30 years. I've been reading true crime my whole life. I've been reading mystery novels my whole life. So I know a little bit about the topic. When we say true crime, what do we mean? Charles Spicer, who is with St. Martin's Press, had this to say about true crime. I define a true crime book as one involving a murder. It's not about art theft. It's not about governmental cover-up. It's really a case involving a murder in which there's an investigation and usually a trial. So that's one viewpoint about what is true crime. I personally agree more with Brian DeForey with Dell Publishing, who said, I don't think a true crime has to have a murder, but it has to have an illegal act. It has to have victims, and it needs some sort of investigation that brings the criminal to justice. So a true crime book has to have a crime, and it has to be true. It's not fiction. It's not something that's made up. It's a true crime. Mystery Writers of America calls it fact crime. And they even have a category each year where they give an Edgar Award to the best written true crime book. And they call it a fact crime book. And in fact, you could go on the Mystery Writers of America website and you could look at their categories of searching the Edgar Awards. And you could go back and you could look at a list of every true crime book that's ever won the Edgar Award all the way back to 1948 for the best true crime book that was written that year. Charles Spicer from St. Martin's Press added, the best of the true crimes give you some insight into the characters, usually the character of the killer and the situation that produced the crime. You know, you don't want to just tell, here's what happened, and just go through and just narrate what happens. You want to make it gripping, where you're getting into the minds of the characters and you're getting into the motives, and so it does take a lot of research that we'll be talking about in more detail. Brian DeForey added, I like to see real psychological insight into a character, both of the victim and of the criminal. I like to see real in-depth research into the place where the crime happened. A strong sense of place is important so that the reader can almost understand how such a crime could happen in such a place. When we talk about places, you know, the best true crime book ever written, most people think, is In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. And you really get a sense of what it was like in that rural part of Kansas where that murder took place. There's another really good book called Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil that was set in Savannah, Georgia. And you really get a sense of what it was like to be in Savannah, Georgia in the era where that crime took place. So place is important. When you're talking about true crime, an editor at Putnam, who's known as Betsy, but she didn't want her real name used, said, "To me, a true crime is the nonfiction equivalent of a mystery. It has interesting people involved, and there's a good investigation." So with all those things in mind, that's what true crime is. Now, the next important thing, if you are thinking about writing a true crime book, is to find the right story, because not every crime is going to make an interesting story to read. One of the jury trials I had in Columbia as an assistant prosecutor in Columbia was a robbery of a break time convenience store where the robber went in and robbed the clerk at gunpoint. The whole thing was on video, and just talking about a routine robbery wouldn't make a very interesting true crime book. The most interesting thing about that particular case is he had put his gun down on the counter at the time he then was putting the money into the bag. And so you had a picture of the gun, which was sort of distinctive looking. And the Columbia police did an excellent job of finding that particular suspect had used that same gun and been caught with it in Jefferson City at a different time. And there are actually pictures of that gun. So some really good detective work solved it. So that would be the beginnings of maybe writing a true crime story. But really, the defendant himself wasn't particularly interesting. He was a young guy who just did a robbery for the routine motive of money. And so you don't ever see that being the right story to be a true crime book. I had a real life murder that would make a good book, but there's a reason why it's never been done. The defendant's name was Clay Waller, and he had murdered his wife, his ex-wife. They were separating, and in the process of getting a divorce, she already had a new boyfriend, and he murdered her, and her body had never been found. But through her cell phone and through other ways, she had 3 children that were left without a mother. They built a strong enough case that I felt comfortable in filing it without a body. And so I met with the family of the woman who was murdered, and I said, "Would you rather get her body, or would you rather have me get first-degree murder and life without parole?" And they said, "Well, we'd really rather get her body and find out for sure what happened," because Clay Waller was denying he'd done anything and pleading not guilty. So I made a plea offer to him that if he would plead guilty to second-degree murder and take us to the body, I'd agree he'd get a sentence of 20 years in prison. So he did that. He got the 20 years, and he took the police to the body. He had actually dug her grave before he killed her in the wet sand next to the Mississippi River over in Illinois. And then he had taken her body across the Mississippi River by boat, put her body in the wet sand and covered it up. And cadaver dogs had even crossed that sand and had not found the body. And so literally that body would never have been found but for that plea bargain. Well, he got to prison, and in prison he wrote a book, or a manuscript for a book, How to Get Away with Killing Your Wife. And so when I got word of that, I thought, well, I'm going to really be upset if his book ends up selling more copies than any of my books. But it had a happy ending for a prosecutor, because by taking her body across state lines from Missouri to Illinois, he'd committed a federal crime, and the federal prosecutor wasn't bound by my plea bargain. So the federal prosecutor charged him with that federal crime, and he got another 35 years to run consecutively with the 20 years that I got him. So for law enforcement, it was a happy ending. But the reason that would never probably become a book is that the family members of the woman who was murdered, there were 3 little kids, and they really don't want to cooperate with an author to have a book written. They don't want any more publicity about it. They just want to let these children grow up without a book coming out about that case. So even if you're thinking, oh, I think I'm going to go write a true crime book about that story, you would need the cooperation of her family to write a really good book where you get insight into her character, and she's the most sympathetic person in that story. So I really don't see that story ever being the right story for anybody. In Cold Blood, Truman Capote's masterpiece, he got the idea for it by reading the newspapers. Just a short little story in the New York Times about this husband and wife that were wealthy, and their two teenage children being murdered in Kansas in a small town. This story was on page 39 of the New York Times. That gave him the idea for the book. And so reading news stories is still probably the best way to get the idea for your true crime story. That there's going to be a lot more involved in making sure it's the right story than just that initial reading of it. Here was a picture from Casey Sepp's book of Harper Lee and Truman Capote walking together. And what they did, they went to the area when they were researching the book. When they were doing In Cold Blood, they went to Kansas and they spent 9 months to a year there doing the research. And I'd always heard that, Harper Lee actually wrote part of In Cold Blood. And I didn't know the answer to that until I read this Furious Hours book. And it was fascinating. Half of the book is devoted to Harper Lee and working on true crime books. And it mentions that Truman Capote had her go with him as his researcher, but she was far more than just a researcher. She actually was the only person to interview dozens and dozens and dozens of the witnesses. She wrote up detailed synopsis of the interviews she had done and gave them to Truman Capote, who hadn't even met with those people. And then he used them in the book that he wrote. So in a sense, she was a co-author, even though she didn't get credit. And it was a masterpiece. And if you haven't read In Cold Blood, you really should, if you're thinking at all about true crime writing, or if you just want to get more involved in reading true crime. A book that I read to get ready for this talk is available online on Kindle by a writer named Gary Provost. He wrote several books about writing, and he wrote this particular book, How to Write and Sell True Crime. And another suggestion he's pointed out is that the story that you pick must be of interest to you and hold your interest, because you're probably going to be involved in that story for months, if not years, as you're doing your research. So it has to be something that interests you and is going to hold your interest for all that hard work that you put into researching and getting the facts you need to tell that story. He said the professional true crime writer knows that she is going to be spending a year or two with the story, so she chooses carefully. When we're talking about finding the right story, Gary Provost pointed out something I agree with 100%. It has to have general interest to the public. I mentioned earlier, a book about somebody who robs a break time maybe isn't going to have general interest to the public. You have to have an interesting criminal. You have to have an interesting victim. You have to have a sense of place, and it should give the reader a chance to see a different world than that reader sees on a day-to-day basis. And there have to be complications that make the story roll along with the protagonist having to overcome conflict after conflict to get justice. So a really good story, one that's really going to be perfect for a true crime book, needs to have all those things: an interesting criminal, an interesting victim, a sense of place, a different world, and complications. Now, probably the most prolific, if not the best, true crime writer so far in history is Ann Rule. She wrote many true crime books, and her first one was A Stranger Beside Me, which was about Ted Bundy. And there was an interesting criminal. If you're talking about an interesting criminal, this was a brilliant young man, handsome, articulate, smart enough to get in law school, but he was a serial killer. And he would kill his victims by befriending them in ways. He had a fake cast he would put on his arm and ask a woman to help him to his car. And then he would knock her unconscious and handcuff her and get her in the car. He had creative ways to get his victims and kill them. And he got away with it for a long time. So it was an interesting criminal, interesting victims. And it was a good story. And she actually had met him in person. And then he cooperated with her after the case was all over. And so she came up with a really good book, The Stranger Beside Me, which was her first one. And she's written an essay about how to write true crime that I'd recommend to you. And I'll show you where it is here in a moment. And one of the things she pointed out was the cardinal rule in true crime is that we must wait until a case has been adjudicated before we write. So what does that mean? You have to wait until the case has gone to trial. And there's reasons for that. For one thing, if the case goes to trial and the person is found not guilty, you're probably not going to be able to write your book. Because if you felt the person was guilty and you write a book saying he was guilty, when he'd been found not guilty, he can end up suing you for libel. So there are legal reasons why you have to wait till the case is over with and has been adjudicated. There's also practical ones, because the police that were involved in investigating the case are not going to talk to you until after the case has gone to trial. The prosecutor ethically can't talk to you until the case has gone to trial. Once the case goes to trial, there'll be a transcript of the trial, and you'll have the witnesses who were sworn to testify under oath. And that's a gold mine for you in getting facts. And the witnesses that were involved, you can then interview them afterwards. So you do need to wait until the case has gone to trial, which is going to sometimes make your project take a couple of years at a minimum. This Mr. Ratter's Handbook has the chapter that Anne Rule wrote about writing true crime. And other things she said was that the newer the case, the better. If there's a newer case, the witnesses are still going to be around. The facts are going to be fresh on their mind. It's just going to be easier to do the research if the case is rather new. If you're doing a case that's old, which Casey Sepp pulled off in Furious Hours, because that case had happened back in the 70s, it's going to be harder. It's going to be harder, but Casey Sepp did a masterful job, I guess partly because Harper Lee had already done so much of the research. Another thing that Anne Rule said when talking about the right case is don't pick an unsolved case. There has to be an ending to please the reader. When you're picking up a true crime book, you want to read about the crime itself. You want to read about the investigation that was done and how did the person get caught. And then you want to read about what happened at the end. Did justice prevail? That's part of true crime. Did justice prevail? And if you picked an unsolved case, it's going to be really unsatisfying to the reader when you get to the end and you're scratching your head as the author and say, well, I really don't know whether he did it or not. That's not going to be a successful true crime book. Now, another case that I had that would have been a really good case as far as having an interesting criminal, interesting victims, was Timothy Wayne Cricher. This was a serial killer that I prosecuted. He had killed 5 women in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, over a period of about 2 years. He also killed 1 or more women in Illinois and Kentucky and Pennsylvania. What made him an interesting subject? He was an EMT. He was a paramedic who during the day was riding an ambulance, saving people's lives. And at night, he was a serial killer. And what was another thing that made the case interesting? Because the way he would stalk his victims, he would go to a Walmart and watch an attractive woman come out. Then he would follow her home and he would do surveillance of her house for a period of time. And then he would break into her house and wait for her to come home, not on the same night he first spotted her, but a couple days later. And then he would kill her in her home. And so it was an interesting criminal. The victims were young and attractive. They were interesting, not all young, but they were all attractive. So he had interesting victims, and it remained unsolved for about 20 to 30 years. And it was solved ultimately through DNA from a vaginal swab that was stored all those years. And so it was a very fascinating subject matter. And actually, authors did notice that it would make a good true crime book. And there have been 3 true crime books written about that case. One of them was written by Bridget DeCosmo, who was a reporter for the Southeast Missourian in Cape Girardeau, Missouri at the time. She had been in court for the various hearings, and she got another reason to wait until the case is over is the police reports become public once the case is over. So you can actually get the police reports and read through them. And another reason to get a conviction before you write is if the person's found not guilty, those police reports do not become public. So once the case was over, she got the police reports and she wrote this book, Serial Murder 101. about about Timothy Cricher. There was a writer from New York who came down to cover the case. And he also interviewed me and interviewed the police officers involved and got a copy of the police reports. And he wrote this book, Predator, which was about the Cricher case. And the third person to write a book about the case was Paul Eccles, who is a Carbondale detective, who is the one who actually solved these cases. He was the driving force that got these cold cases solved. And then he ended up writing the book In Cold Pursuit, along with Christine Byers, who is a writer for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And now I think she's with a TV station in St. Louis, but she co-authored that book with him. So there were 3 different books written about that Cricher case. And who knows, maybe there'll be another one if somebody else comes up with another angle. You know, I've read all 3 and I can't really tell you which one is better than the others. They're different though. It's interesting to read the different 3 just to see how different writers approach the subject matter and how different writers structured the books. The big thing is once you've found the case, once you've decided I want to write a true crime book about that case, you're a long way from being done yet because you need to do the research. This Gary Provost said a true crime book without a good deal of detail would be a boring book. You know, and so you really do need to do the research. And so I've got some suggestions for you about how to go about doing that. Ann Rule, in that same essay, said, in researching a crime, we must figure out how to elicit information that seems impossible to get. We have to ask people about pain and horror that they'd rather forget. We must ask detectives and prosecutors to share their investigations and feelings with us. And she said, each time I start working on a new book, I am convinced that I will never get enough information, that nobody is going to talk to me, and that I'll end up with a pathetically thin book. And each time I end up with more details and inside information that I can squeeze between 2 covers. So as you begin, you just have faith that it will all come together. And that's one of the sad things about Casey Sepp's book, Furious Hours, is that Harper Lee went down there and devoted a year of her life to researching the true crime book that she was wanting to write on her own about the murder of Robert Burns, or the murder of Willie Maxwell by Robert Burns, and Maxwell's his whole history of killing relatives for insurance money. That was her plan to write that book, and it didn't pan out for her. But Casey Sepp was able to pull it off. Now, Gary Provost said about the research, a true crime book to succeed must have depth and richness, far beyond the simple facts of the case. And much of that richness finds its way into your manuscript because you were resourceful. You know, if you're thinking about the idea of a robbery of the break time that I said couldn't be a true crime book, well, if you really found out some interesting things about that criminal, if you really found out some interesting things about that victim, you could turn that into an interesting true crime book. If you wanted to turn it into a detailed book about African Americans, young men committing crimes in this era, you could maybe turn it into a worthwhile true crime book. You know, there's ways that you could take a mundane thing and turn it into a true crime book, but you have to have that depth and richness, and there's no way to get around it other than getting the research done and getting the cooperation of the people that you need to talk to get that book done. And Gary Provost pointed out, by far your richest vein of information is the series of interviews that you will conduct, because you're not just going to go by the transcript, because a court transcript is sort of boring to read usually. You're going to need to interview the witnesses themselves and get the story behind the story and find out things that are irrelevant to the trial, that aren't coming into the trial, but really pull the heartstrings and really make that story something that readers are going to read. Now, one thing is, if the case went to trial, you want to get a transcript of that trial, and you want to get a transcript of the hearings, things like motions to suppress confessions or motions to suppress evidence. You want to get the transcripts, and you can get those from the court reporter. Now, they're not free. The court reporter will charge you. Sometimes the prosecutor will have those transcripts when the trial is all over, and you might be able to talk the prosecutor into making a copy for you. But either through the prosecutor or through the court reporter, you need to get a copy of the transcript. Here was a copy from the Furious Hours book of the actual check that Harper Lee wrote for $1,000 to the court reporter on January 22nd, 1978, for the copy of the trial of Robert Burns, because that was the trial that she was going to write about. And so she was getting a copy of that transcript. That's what you need to do if you're doing a true crime book. You need to get a copy of the transcript. And a nice thing about the transcript is the witnesses are under oath and they have to answer. At a trial, a witness just can't say, well, you know what, I don't want to be bothered. I don't want to answer that question. The only reason they have legitimately to not answer the question is if the answer would incriminate them. Then they can take the Fifth Amendment protection to not answer. So except for the criminal himself, witnesses have to answer at trial, and they're under oath and can be prosecuted for perjury if they lie. So the transcripts are a gold mine. You might not even have any trial scenes in your book. You might just be talking about the crime itself and how the police caught the person. And you might not even get into the trial other than to say he was found guilty and got life in prison plus 20 years. You might not even actually talk about the trial, but the transcripts are that gold mine. If you do talk about the trial, be careful not to be repetitive. I wrote a manuscript for a mystery novel one time where I laid out the crime being committed. I laid out the police investigation. Then I laid out the witnesses testifying at trial, talking about the same things that the reader would have already seen when the police are doing the investigation. And the agent who read it pointed out, you're really being repetitive here. You need to decide, are you going to show that part at the trial and this part at the investigation, and not just be repetitive and say it over and over again. So keep that in mind. There was a good quote in Casey Sepp's Furious Hours where she said, reporters love trials because they are transfixed by a process in which the person being asked the question actually has to answer it. He cannot say he would rather not comment. And that's one, as I said, one big reason why you definitely want to track down the transcript. In doing the research, you want to get the police reports and you want to talk to the investigating officers. As I mentioned earlier, the police reports are not public until after the trial is over, because otherwise they'd get in the news media and potential jurors would have read the police reports online before they even go, and then they couldn't be fair jurors. So police reports are not public until after a trial. And if the person is found not guilty in Missouri, they become closed documents and basically never become public. But if there's been the conviction, you want to work on getting the police reports. You can usually get those from the police department or from the prosecutor's office. You want to see what officers were involved in the investigation, and you want to talk to the ones that seem to be important to you in the case. And they're not going to talk to you before the trial because they're not supposed to be talking to somebody and have something come out in the media before the trial. But after the trial is over, there's a good chance the investigating officers will be able to get permission from their supervisors to talk to you. You want to talk to the prosecutor for sure, because I've been a prosecutor and I know that when you're doing a police investigation, one officer might do one thing, another officer might do another thing, another officer might do another thing, but one single officer may not know everything about the investigation. But it all ends up going through the prosecutor, who has to read the police reports, talk to all the witnesses, build the case, and make the assessment of what's important and what isn't. And so the prosecutor is a key resource to you if you're thinking about doing a true crime book about a particular case. The witnesses, once they testified at trial, you're going to be able to talk to the witnesses if they will. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes they won't, and that might cause your true crime book to die on the vine right then.
Hey, Morley.
Yes.
I have a question.
All right.
How hard is it to get the investigating officers to speak with you? Is it, as a prosecutor, it was probably easy for you.
Well, if you've ever seen Dateline, you will see that a police officer who has successfully solved a crime, sometimes by doing something rather brilliant, is going to be tickled to talk about it. And so if they can get the approval from their chief of police or their sheriff, which they usually will be able to do, because law enforcement gets tired of having all these negative stories come out where people are slamming them. And so they like to have something come out that where something was done right and something was done successfully. So I think that once the case is over, you'll probably be successful. Now, I had a case 20 years ago where a millionaire killed his right-hand man in his business because the right-hand man had had an affair with the millionaire's teenage daughter. And that case went to trial. And at the time, it was the longest criminal trial in Missouri history. The case lasted 4 weeks. And when it was over, this was back before the internet. When it was over, a TV show called A Current Affair wanted to do a TV show about that case. But the widow of the man who was killed told me, please don't do that. Please don't cooperate, because I have 2 teenage children and I don't want them. They go to school and they're already hearing a lot about their father being murdered and some bad things he was doing that got him killed. So please don't cooperate. So I told the reporter from A Current Affair, don't come to Missouri because I'm not going to talk to you. And that reporter came anyway and showed up at my door. And I said, no, I'm not going to talk to you. And it was like the reporter had never met a prosecutor who wasn't anxious to beat his chest. And then the reporter tried to talk to the investigating officers, and each of them called me and said, should I cooperate? And I said, well, I can't tell you what to do, but here's why I'm not. The widow doesn't want us to. So none of them would cooperate. So no story ever got made about that. So maybe they won't cooperate if they have a reason not to, but I would say generally you're going to be able to get cooperation.
All right, thank you.
So the victim or the victims are key. And you will see some of them, a couple of them might have testified at the trial. A couple of them will be named in police reports, but you want to spread your net wider, because the things that the prosecutor is putting on at trial are going to just be narrowly focused things to the crime and to the impact it's had on the immediate family. But you want to talk to the victim's close friends and relatives to really find out all you can, and things you find out will be important to your book that never would have come out for trial, because your book, you really want to pull on the heartstrings of the reader, make them care and feel emotionally invested in that victim. And those are things that the prosecutor is not supposed to do very much of, because it's considered prejudicial to the defendant. So you're going to want to cast a wide net and talk to as many victims, close friends, and relatives as possible. You also want to try to talk to the criminal. And it's surprising, a lot of the criminals, once it's over, once they're sitting in prison, will cooperate with somebody who's writing a book. You can't necessarily believe everything they say, but you can get good background about them, where they went to school, their teachers, things that happened in their lives, and you can form assessments that maybe this is what made them turn out the way they did. The more information you can get about that criminal, the better book you're probably going to end up being, even if you don't use all of it. I've had at least one case, though, where a true crime writer got so close to the criminal that she ended up believing the criminal more than she believed the prosecutor and the police. And I think that she was hoping for a not guilty verdict. And then once it came back guilty, she sort of didn't have a book anymore because she was so invested in planning to write a book about, oh, he didn't do it, he got off. So be careful to not let the criminal pull the wool over your eyes, but to look at all the facts. The criminal's lawyer is another deep source, because if they cooperate, they'll be able to tell you their strategy. They'll be able they can't reveal things their client told them without the client's permission. But if the criminal is cooperating and tells his lawyer, the lawyer can cooperate too. Boy, you're going to have a resource to really tell both sides of an interesting story. And don't forget friends and relatives of the criminal. Interviewing parents, interviewing friends, interviewing former teachers, all gives you more information that might give you that depth of research that makes your book compelling. And people who knew the criminal, fellow employees, people that worked with them, all these things are resources that may not have come out in the trial. But if you're sort of following a spider web of asking one person, well, who else knew him well, and asking those people, who else knew him well, you can end up gathering a lot of information. Now, one thing you need to remember is to write a good true crime book, or to write a good mystery novel, or to write a good novel in general. You have to identify at least one sympathetic character and try to tell at least some of the story from his or her viewpoint. In that case where the I talked about earlier, the Clay Waller case where he had dug his wife's grave, his ex-wife's grave, before he even killed her, and her family didn't want cooperation. She was the only sympathetic person in that story. So without cooperation of the people who knew her, you weren't going to be able to tell that story. You need to have a sympathetic character to tell at least part of the story from, to have the readers keep wanting to turn the pages to find out more about that character, that they care about what happens. Donald Mass wrote a really excellent book, Writing the Breakout Novel, where he said a character's stakes will seem strong only to the extent that the character is sympathetic. You really need to have at least one sympathetic character. If you haven't read this book, Writing the Breakout Novel by Donald Mass was an agent, a literary agent in New York City. He's still there, and he's written a couple good books about writing. And he said one of the problems that mystery writers have is how to make a murder truly matter when the body is discovered on page 1 and the victim is now unknowable because the victim's dead and the body is already cooling. And so that's a problem that a true crime writer has, and that's a problem that a mystery writer has. And Earl Stanley Gardner wrote more than 80 novels that featured Perry Mason. And I read an essay he wrote about writing, and he said he never started out his books with the dead body. He started out with the group of characters that would involve the killer and the victim and a couple other people who were red herrings. And Perry Mason would meet those people. And then ultimately, in like chapter 3 or 4, one of them gets killed and the other one becomes his client as a suspect who always was innocent. And so he said he never started out with a dead body. Abby, do we have another question?
Yeah. So we have a question from Elizabeth Haas. She's wondering if the accused is convicted and then later exonerated, can you still pursue writing the story?
I would say yes, because legally, the jury had found the person guilty, and you would be reporting on what happened. So I think as long as you're being truthful about that, and as long as at the end you had an epilogue that ultimately his conviction was overturned, and here's why, I think legally you'd still be okay.
Could sort of be a twist at the end.
Yeah, that would be a nice surprise ending. In that book that the fellow from New York wrote about the Cricher case, you see this says author photo. It's a good idea to have your camera along and to take pictures of the people that you interview. This was the day he interviewed me when he was working on his book. Take pictures of the people you interview, because true crime books always usually want to have photographs. And so as the author, you can take a lot of those photographs yourself. Depending on the type of book you're writing, you might have some crime scene photos and things that you've gotten from the police department. It just depends on the type of book you want to write, but do have a camera along. Of course, these days with cell phones, you don't really need a separate camera. You could take photos with your cell phone. Just take some quality photographs of the people and go to the place where the crime happened so you can get a feel for that place. You might notice something that you'll end up putting in your book that you wouldn't have noticed if you had not been there in person. Attend the trial. Ideally, you'll get the idea for the story before the case has gone to trial. You can attend the trial. Here's a trial I had involving a death penalty murder case that was tried in front of Judge Frank Conley, and he's not asleep there. He happened to be blinking, but this was during the closing argument. So attend the trial, because you can see what did the witness look like, what was the witness's demeanor when they were on the stand, was the witness crying, what was the witness wearing. You'll see all kinds of things that the transcript itself isn't going to show. So if you can afford it to travel wherever the trial is going, you want to attend the trial if you can. As far as the actual writing of the book, you want to write it like a novel. And when I say write it like a novel, what do I mean? I mean, you want to put tension and conflict and opposition on each page. And that's the same thing. Tension and conflict and opposition needs to be on each page. And whether you're writing fiction or whether you're writing true crime, you want to have that tension so the reader keeps wanting to turn the page. If you're just blah, 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 telling a boring story, they're not going to want to turn the page. You want to have conflict, that this character wants this, but this character wants this, and there's some tension between them. And so you want to put that tension on every page. Gary Provost put it this way: opposition is the essential element in storytelling. It can also be called conflict. It means that as your character strives to reach his goal, something tries to thwart him. And so every good book that you pick up, you can look at virtually every page and there's some tension. A character wants something on that page and is being thwarted in some way. And it might be something small or it might be something big, but that tension, that conflict is what makes it a story that people want to read. Donald Mass in his book pointed out, without a doubt, the most common flaw I see in manuscripts is the failure to invest every page of the novel with tension. Low tension equals low interest. High tension equals high interest. And another thing that every good book about writing, and I've got a whole bookshelf of them at home, says to write in scenes so you show but don't tell. And when you say that, well, what does that mean? Well, the story is brought to life through the art of showing, not just telling. A scene is taking place at a specific time in a specific location, and you'll typically have dialogue going between the characters. You'll have that conflict going on between the characters, and scenes are supplemented by general journalistic summary type writing. Like to take, for example, In Cold Blood. You know, if you were just going to do simple general journalistic summary type writing, you would say a wealthy farmer in Kansas and his invalid wife and his teenage daughter and son were all murdered one night in Kansas. And you know, that's an awful thing to hear about, but it doesn't really keep you wanting to turn the pages. But if you end up showing the scene of them being at home and hearing a break of glass as somebody's breaking into it, and you see them getting up to go see what it was, if you see that the teenage daughter could hear that a robbery was taking place downstairs, her father was being robbed by multiple voices, so she took her jewelry and hid it in her shoe. Those are scenes where you're showing what's happening. You're not just telling. So there was a writer I saw give a speech in New York City. His name was Sean Kirchover. He's a mystery writer. And in his lecture, he said he thinks of scenes as fence posts. And he's got fence posts. He has maybe 20 fence posts of the scenes that are going to be in his mystery novel. And that's where the characters are going to come to life and have the conflict. And you're going to see the scene happen, but they'll be connected by the narrative that moves the story along, where it's the journalistic summary type thing. But he talked about writing by fence posts. And I've remembered that comment as I've worked on it. Gary Provost said, not every word in your book should be in a scene. Probably half your book won't be. He said, I'm emphasizing scenes because I think that's what new true crime writers neglect. They just start telling the story. This happened, then that happened, and it all lies flat on the page. And to write scenes, you want to write scenes when there's conflict between the characters or when there's great emotion, like the person's actually being killed, or the person is finding the body, or the mother's learning that her son's been murdered, or at a time of discovery, the police walk in and they find the body lying there. You want to do scenes when there are those types of things and then connect them with the journalism. And also remember, there's a difference between story and plot. The story is chronological, or you'd say, well, on such a date in Kansas, this farmer and his wife and his 2 kids were murdered, and then the police did this and did this and did this. But plotting is your choice of what to tell and when. You might decide to start out with a scene from a trial, or you might decide to start out with some other dramatic thing as a prologue and then have a flashbacks to the beginning. So plotting is when you're deciding what are you going to tell when, and you won't want to make the mistake of laying all your cards on the table too soon. You want to hide some of the facts so the reader's finding them out as they go along and they get satisfaction of discovering things. Gary Provost said, I plot with an understanding that I'm telling a story, not simply repeating events. Telling a story is different. It means that I want to reveal events in a way that makes the reading experience compelling. In this book just came out this year, How to Write a Mystery. And if you're writing true crime, and there's an essay about writing true crime in this too, but if you're writing true crime, everything about writing a mystery also applies to true crime. And this Deborah Crombie said, a plot is not the story. A plot is a framework for the story, a structure to hang your story on. Plots require conflict whether it's between characters, within characters, or between characters in the world. So remember that. And then when you're doing the writing, once you have all the facts of the case, you have to think long and hard, sometimes for months, for the best way to tell it. Because there is a best way to tell the story, and it might not come with you the first time you sit down. So you want to think about how you're going to structure it, how you're going to tell it. And the best way is usually a way that is most like a suspense novel. And often you want to start your plot with the gripping part of the story, and then have flashbacks. And Casey Sepp did a masterful job of this. If you've seen her prologue, you really could not do a better job of starting a book off in a suspenseful way. As she said, nobody recognized her. Harper Lee was well known, but not by sight. And it's unlikely that anyone in the courtroom would have figured out who she was. Reporters flocked to Alexander City to cover the tale of the murderous voodoo preacher and the vigilante who shot him. One of the state's best trial lawyers was arguing one of the state's strangest cases, and the state's most famous author was there to write about it. The mystery in the courtroom that day was what would become of the man who shot the Reverend Willie Maxwell. But for decades after the verdict, the mystery was what became of Harper Lee's book. You know, she did just a fantastic job of picking just the right way to start that out with a hook that catches the reader and makes the reader want to know what happened with that murder, and why didn't Harper Lee get that book written. With characterization, in a true crime book, you're going to create your character by what you choose to tell from all the true information you have about it. You know, in fiction, you're making up everything. You can make up everything, but in true crime, you're dealing with a real person, but you're going to characterize that person by what you choose to show. Once you've done all that research, talk to friends and family, and really talk that person yourself, and you create the character by what you choose to put in there. And you reveal the character to the reader by the character's actions, by his appearance, his words, by speaking directly to the reader about that character. And if your dialogue should reveal character or move the story forward, or both. If there's no tension in the dialogue, don't write it. You know, generally you're not going to want dialogue like, oh, it's a nice day today. The weather's really pleasant. It's just a great weather day. That you wouldn't want that dialogue. However, if this was going to be people are going to be killed by a hurricane in a few hours, then the fact that they're saying, oh, the weather's really nice, you'd be saying, turn on the radio, there's a hurricane coming. You know, if it might be that a talk about the weather is going to be interesting, but probably most likely not. Another really good book to read, The Emotional Craft of Fiction. It's another book by Donald Mass. He said, put emotion in your characters. You know, what does that character feel when they found the body? What was that character feeling when they took the witness stand to testify? You know, you don't care about a series of events unless you care about that person. And you're not going to get that information unless you're talking to that person and interviewing that person outside the courtroom. Gary Provost pointed out plots move forward because characters have goals. And Donald Mass said, what does your protagonist need? What is his goal? What does he yearn for? On every page, you want to have that character wanting something, and that keeps the reader wanting to turn the page. And there are major goals in every true crime book, such as the detective's goal of catching the criminal's goal of blowing up the feed store. There are intermediate goals, such as the detective's goal of getting the case assigned to him, or the criminal's goal of acquiring dynamite. You know, there's not just the ultimate goal, but there's other goals that you can work into the story to make the reader want to turn the page. So look at each page of your manuscript and ask yourself, what does this character want? And if you don't know what the character wants, then neither does the reader. And if the reader doesn't know what a character wants, he has no reason to keep turning the pages to see what happens next. Now, when you get to the revision stage, the best quote I've ever seen was from an essay I read by Joseph Wambaugh. Joseph Wambaugh was a former police officer in Los Angeles, and he wrote the novel The Choir Boys and a bunch of other successful novels. And he wrote several true crime books too, The Onion Field and several others. And one thing he wrote that I 100% agree with, he said, I'm not a great writer, but I'm a great rewriter. You know, once you've written your first draft, you're not done. You need to go back and cut and paste and revise and rewrite and make that manuscript as good as you can possibly make it. And remember that quote, I'm not a great writer, but I'm a great rewriter. And Stephen King wrote a wonderful book on writing. He wrote it after he was hit by a drunk driver when he was jogging, and he thought he was going to die. And so he wrote this book about writing. And I went to a Mr. Writers America seminar one time. There were 250 published writers in the room, and Stephen King was giving a talk. And when he mentioned his book on writing, he got a standing ovation because every writer in that room had read it. And we're talking about people who were all published novelists. And Stephen King said, if I write rapidly, putting down my story exactly as it comes into my mind, only looking back to check the names of my characters and the relevant parts of their backstories, I find that I can keep up with my original enthusiasm and at the same time outrun the self-doubt that's always wanting to settle in. So you're talking about a guy who's been on the bestseller lists for decades, but he still has self-doubt. And he says his goal is to write fast on that first draft, get that first draft done, and then go back and revise. And he pointed out in On Writing his formula. His second draft ends up being shorter than his first by about 10%. His second draft is first draft minus 10%. He said it always works out that way, that he sharpens it and he makes it better by taking out a lot of the fluff. And if you've seen how fat some of his books is, it makes you amazed to think how long some of those first drafts must have been. You need to finish your story. Vincent Bugliosi is a great crime writer. He worked 7 days a week to finish his Edgar Award winning book about the Kennedy assassination, Reclaiming History. And I had finished my book, Scoundrels to the Hoosegow, about the time that he was working on that book. And I wanted to get a quote from him, and my publisher had contacted him. And ultimately, even though he was working 7 days a week on his book, he took the time to give a quote from my book. He said, Morley Swingle's Scoundrels of the Hoosegow is not only consistently fascinating, but there is much to be learned from it about life in and out of the American courtroom. I highly recommend this engrossing book to the general reader, and in particular to members of the prosecutorial profession. So that was a real honor that I still am thankful to him, the late Vincent Bugliosi, for taking the time to read my manuscript. Harper Lee, in Casey Sepp pointed out that Harper Lee said to require being a serious writer requires discipline that is iron-fisted. It is sitting down and doing it every day, whether you think you have it in you or not, every day, alone. And every good lecturer I've ever heard talk about writing says that when you're writing, the way you deal with writer's block is just to keep going on that first draft. Just plow ahead, even if you know that sentence isn't perfect right now, just get that first draft done. Don't feel like your prose has to be as good as Ernest Hemingway's at that point. Just get that first draft written, then you can revise and rewrite. And I sort of think that's probably what happened to Harper Lee, why she never got her book about Robert Burns murdering the Reverend William Maxwell done, because she'd already been fantastically successful with To Kill a Mockingbird. So she probably wanted her true crime book that she was coming out with to be the best true crime book ever written. And so probably that's what stopped her from being successful. Another thing was that maybe she just didn't feel Robert Burns. She got to interview him in person, the killer. He had shot his victim to death at a funeral home in front of 300 witnesses. And so there really wasn't much question about what happened. And maybe she didn't even find him that interesting as a criminal. So who knows exactly what happened with Harper Lee. But when she said this quote that was in Casey Sepp's book, writing is easy. All you do is sit staring at the blank sheet of paper until the drops of blood form on your forehead. It sort of shows that she wasn't just following the type of advice Stephen King gave of getting that first draft done, that she was just striving too hard to be perfect with her first draft. As I mentioned earlier, you want to read the best true crime books. If you're thinking about writing true crime, go to that Mr. Writers America website. They have the winners of the Edgar Award for best true crime book all the way back to 1948. So you want to read a lot of those. You definitely want to read In Cold Blood because it's a book that really showed that true crime could be literature. Before In Cold Blood, you'd have a lot of true crime stories in magazines, and you'd have some sensational true crime books that weren't literature. But In Cold Blood really was the first one that true crime became literature. My personal favorite true crime book ever is called The Blooding by Joseph Wambaugh. He was a former police officer, but he wrote this book about the first murder case that was ever solved by DNA. And it truly reads like a suspense novel, and it gives the history of DNA in a really readable way. And it took place in England, where in a town of about 5,000 people, where a teenage girl was raped and murdered. And a local college professor said to the police department, well, you know what? I could find the DNA in the semen that was left in that girl, and we could end up getting DNA samples from every man in town. We could find out who killed her. And they didn't have the pesky things like the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in England. So sure enough, that's what they did. It's a really fascinating book. Read anything at all by Anne Rule, because all of hers are well done. Read anything by Vincent Bugliosi. They're all fantastic. And if you're thinking about is true crime for you, remember what Gary Provost said: writing true crime is not for you if you're intimidated by authority, if you can't stand the company of lawyers, or if you cannot see the humanity in even the most violent and remorseless of criminals. It's not for you if you're bored by asking the same questions of several people, if you're horrified by the idea of reading 20 volumes of trial transcript, or if you get claustrophobic visiting people in prison. You're going to need the doggedness of a journalist and the talent of a novelist. When Gary Provost was writing his book about how to write true crime, he said that Joe McGinniss declined to be interviewed for his book on writing true crime because Joe McGinniss didn't think of himself as just a true crime writer. He didn't want the public to think of him that way. But here's his book, Fatal Vision, that says a true crime classic. I think probably that Harper Lee would have been delighted if she'd have been able to finish her true crime book, and if it would have been on the shelf next to Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. And it's awfully sad for us she didn't finish it. But Casey Sepp found a way to finish that story that Harper Lee just couldn't find the right way to tell. She did it by making Harper Lee a character herself. The last half of that book is about Harper Lee and all the hard research she did in trying to write that book. And perhaps Casey Sepp did it by just living the Nike motto, just do it. And so I really recommend this book, and I think you'll really enjoy it if you haven't finished it yet.
Just before we wrap up, I wanted to see if anybody in the audience had a few questions for Morley before we conclude. I'm watching the chat for questions. I'm not seeing anything coming through. So I just want to thank you, Morley, for taking your time and doing all this research. I was taking notes during the presentation. There's a couple books that you mentioned that I want to read. So I really appreciate you sharing all of your insights and your experiences with us tonight. And thank everybody for tuning in this evening. And please stay tuned, as there's much more to come in the One Read series this month. And with that, I will end the program, and good night to everyone. Thank you.